The dust devils were swirling across the prairie when the sky turned the color of old bruises, and Belinda Stone knew she had made a terrible mistake leaving the protection of the canyon at dawn. She was 19 years old, Apache born and raised in the traditions of her people, and she had been tracking a wounded deer for her grandmother when the first drops of rain struck her face like pebbles thrown from heaven. The year was 1878, and the land stretching between the Rocky Mountains and the eastern plains of Colorado was unforgiving to those who did not respect its moods. Belinda had respected the land all her life, had learned to read the signs in the clouds and the behavior of the animals, but her grandmother had been sick for 3 days now, weak with fever, and the need for fresh meat had driven Belinda further from home than she had intended. The storm came fast, as they always did in this part of the territory. One moment the sky was merely threatening, dark and brooding but still holding its violence in check, and the next the heavens opened with a fury that seemed personal. Rain came down in sheets, so thick Belinda could barely see her own hands in front of her face. The wind whipped her long black hair across her eyes, blinding her, and she stumbled forward trying to remember which direction led back to the canyon where her people had made their temporary camp. They were a small band, barely 30 souls, survivors of the forced relocations that had torn apart so many Apache families. They moved often, staying ahead of the soldiers and the settlers who saw them as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. Belinda's deerskin dress was soaked through within minutes, clinging to her slim frame and offering no protection against the driving rain. She wrapped her arms around herself and pushed forward, but the landscape had transformed into something alien and hostile. The familiar landmarks were gone, swallowed by the gray curtain of the storm. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the world in brief, startling flashes that left purple afterimages burning in her vision. Thunder followed immediately, so loud it seemed to shake the ground beneath her feet. She did not know how long she walked. Time lost all meaning in the chaos of the storm. Her moccasins sank into mud that sucked at her feet with every step. Water ran down her face, into her mouth, tasting of earth and electricity. She called out once, twice, but her voice was torn away by the wind before the sound could travel more than a few feet. Panic began to claw at her chest, but she forced it down. Panic killed. Her father had taught her that before he died at the hands of soldiers 3 winters ago. Stay calm, stay alert, stay alive. The lightning struck a cottonwood tree perhaps 50 yards to her left, and the explosion of sound and light knocked Belinda to her knees. The tree split down the middle, one half crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks that the rain immediately extinguished. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She had to find shelter. She had to get out of this open ground before the lightning found her. That was when she saw the shape looming out of the storm. At first she thought it was a boulder, one of the massive rocks that dotted the prairie like the bones of ancient giants. But as she drew closer, squinting through the rain, she realized it was a building. A cabin, low and solid, built from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to gray. Smoke rose from a stone chimney despite the rain, and warm yellow light glowed in one small window. Belinda hesitated. Her people had learned to be wary of settlers' homes. More often than not, they brought only trouble. But the alternative was staying out in the storm, and she could feel the cold beginning to seep into her bones. Her grandmother needed her alive, needed the meat Belinda had failed to bring home. She would rather face whatever danger waited inside the cabin than let the storm claim her life. She stumbled to the door and raised her fist to knock, but before her knuckles could touch the wood, it swung open. A man stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the color of winter wheat and eyes that were startlingly blue even in the dim light. He looked to be in his mid-20s, maybe 26 or 27, with a weathered face that spoke of long days under the sun. He wore dark trousers and a simple homespun shirt, and his hand rested on the grip of a revolver holstered at his hip. For a moment they simply stared at each other. Then the man seemed to shake himself out of his surprise. "Jesus Christ, girl, get in here before you get struck by lightning." Belinda did not move. She had understood his words, more or less. She had learned English from traders and missionaries, though she rarely had cause to use it. But understanding and trusting were two different things. The man seemed to realize she was afraid. He carefully took his hand away from his gun and held both palms up in a gesture of peace. "I am not going to hurt you, I promise, but you cannot stay out there. Please, come inside." Perhaps it was the genuine concern in his voice, or perhaps it was simply that she had run out of choices. But Belinda found herself stepping across the threshold into the warmth of the cabin. Water dripped from her clothing onto the wooden floor, forming puddles around her feet. She stood shivering, hugging herself as the man closed the door against the storm. "My name is Preston Xavier," he said, speaking slowly and clearly as if he thought she might not understand. "This is my home. You are safe here." Belinda lifted her chin and met his eyes. "I speak your language," she said, her accent thick but her words clear. "I am called Belinda Stone." Preston blinked in surprise, then a slow smile spread across his face. It was a good smile, warm and reaching all the way to his eyes, and Belinda felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Well then, Belinda Stone, let me get you something dry to wear before you catch your death of cold." He moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin and began pulling out clothing. The cabin was small but well kept, one room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and living space all together. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and a pot of something that smelled like beans and salt pork hung over the flames. A narrow bed was pushed against one wall, neatly made with rough blankets. A table and two chairs occupied the center of the room, and various tools and supplies hung from pegs on the walls. Preston turned back to her holding a shirt and a pair of trousers that would be far too large for her. "These are all I have, I am afraid. I do not get many visitors and certainly none wearing dresses, but they are dry, and that is what matters. You can change behind that screen there." He gestured to a folding screen in the corner that partially concealed a washstand and basin. Belinda took the clothes from him, careful not to let her fingers brush his. She moved behind the screen and peeled off her sodden dress, wincing as the wet leather clung to her skin. She wrung it out as best she could and draped it over the top of the screen, then pulled on the shirt and trousers Preston had given her. The shirt hung nearly to her knees, and she had to roll the trouser legs up several times to keep from tripping over them. When she emerged, she must have looked ridiculous, but Preston did not laugh. Instead, he gestured to one of the chairs by the fire. "Sit. Warm yourself. Are you hungry?" Belinda was suddenly aware that she had not eaten since the night before. Her stomach growled loudly enough that Preston definitely heard it, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks. She sat in the offered chair, holding her hands out to the fire, and nodded. Preston ladled stew into a bowl and handed it to her, along with a spoon. "It is not fancy, but it is hot and it will fill your belly." The stew was simple but good, beans and pork and onions in a thick broth. Belinda ate slowly, savoring the warmth that spread through her body with each bite. Preston sat across from her with his own bowl, eating in companionable silence. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin it felt safe and almost peaceful. "How did you come to be out in that storm?" Preston asked after a while. His voice was curious but not accusatory, Belinda set down her spoon and met his gaze. "I was hunting. For my grandmother. She is sick and our camp is running low on meat. I tracked a deer too far from home and the storm caught me." Preston frowned. "Your camp? How far?" "I do not know any more. I lost my way in the rain, but it was in the canyon to the west where the red rocks rise up from the plain." "I know the place," Preston said slowly. "That is a good 10 miles from here, maybe more. You walked a long way in that storm." 10 miles. Belinda closed her eyes briefly. No wonder she felt so exhausted. "I need to get back. My grandmother needs me." "Not tonight, you do not," Preston said firmly. "That storm is not going to let up until morning at the earliest, and even if it did, you cannot walk 10 miles in the dark across terrain you do not know. You would fall into a ravine and break your neck. You will stay here tonight, and I will help you find your way back in the morning." Belinda wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She was exhausted, still cold despite the fire and the hot food, and the thought of going back out into the storm made her want to weep. She nodded slowly. "Thank you. You are kind to help me." Preston shrugged, looking a little uncomfortable with the praise. "It is the decent thing to do. Out here, we help each other when we can. The land is hard enough without us making it harder on ourselves." They talked a little more as the evening wore on. Preston told her that he had built this cabin 2 years ago, after saving enough money from his work as a cowboy on one of the big ranches to the south. He had filed a claim on this land and was trying to start a small ranch of his own, running a modest herd of cattle that he hoped to grow over time. It was lonely work, he admitted, but he loved the freedom of it, the feeling that he was building something that belonged to him and him alone. Belinda found herself telling him about her life as well, though she was more cautious with her words. She spoke of her grandmother, who had raised her after her mother died giving birth to a stillborn son when Belinda was 7. She spoke of her people, always moving, always looking over their shoulders for soldiers or settlers who would drive them further from the lands they had once called home. She did not speak of the violence she had witnessed, the friends and family who had been killed or taken away, but Preston seemed to sense the weight of what she left unsaid. His eyes were sympathetic, and he did not press her for details. When the fire began to burn low, Preston stood and added another log. "You should take the bed," he said, gesturing to the narrow cot against the wall. "I will sleep on the floor by the fire. I have done it plenty of times before, and I will be warm enough." "I cannot take your bed," Belinda protested. "You have already done so much. I insist. You have been through an ordeal, and you need proper rest if you are going to make that walk tomorrow." Belinda could see there was no point in arguing. Preston had a stubborn set to his jaw that reminded her of her grandmother when she had made up her mind about something. She stood and moved to the bed, lying down on top of the blankets. Preston brought her another blanket and spread it over her, his movements careful and respectful. "Sleep well, Belinda Stone," he said softly. "Sleep well, Preston Xavier," she replied. She listened as he spread bedding on the floor and settled himself near the hearth. The storm still raged outside, but the sound of the rain on the roof and the crackling of the fire were oddly soothing. Despite everything, despite being in a stranger's home far from her people, Belinda felt safe. It was a strange feeling, and she did not quite know what to make of it. She was asleep within minutes. When Belinda woke, pale morning light was filtering through the cabin's single window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that smelled of wet earth and fresh growth. She sat up slowly, disoriented for a moment, then remembered where she was. Preston was already awake, standing at the stove and frying something in a cast-iron skillet. The smell of bacon filled the cabin, making her stomach rumble again. "Good morning," Preston said when he noticed she was awake. "I hope you slept well. Breakfast is almost ready." Belinda stood and folded the blanket he had given her, setting it neatly on the bed. "I slept very well, thank you." They ate breakfast together, bacon and cornbread with strong black coffee that made Belinda's eyes water. Preston was cheerful in the morning, joking about the storm and telling her stories about some of the other cowboys he had worked with before striking out on his own. Belinda found herself smiling, even laughing a little, though she was anxious to get back to her grandmother. After breakfast, Preston saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes. "You will ride," he said when Belinda started to protest. "I will walk alongside. We will make better time that way, and you will not arrive back at your camp exhausted." Belinda had ridden horses before, though not often. Her people preferred to travel on foot when they could, saving their few horses for the elders and the very young. Preston helped her up into the saddle, his hand steadying her, and then took the reins and began leading the horse west toward the canyon where her people were camped. The landscape looked different in daylight, scrubbed clean by the storm. Wildflowers were beginning to bloom across the prairie, splashes of yellow and purple and white that nodded in the gentle breeze. Birds sang from the scattered trees, and in the distance, Belinda could see a small herd of pronghorn antelope grazing peacefully. It was beautiful, this land, even if it was harsh. They talked as they walked, the conversation coming easier now that they had spent time together. Preston asked her about Apache traditions, about the stories her grandmother told, about what it was like to live always on the move. Belinda answered his questions honestly, surprised by his genuine interest. Most white men she had encountered either feared her people or looked down on them. Preston seemed to see her as simply another person, no better or worse than himself. In turn, she asked him about his life before Colorado, and he told her about growing up on a farm in Missouri, the youngest of 4 sons. There had not been enough land for all of them, so he had headed west at 18 to make his own way in the world. He had worked as a cowboy for 8 years, driving cattle north to the railheads in Kansas and Wyoming, before finally saving enough to buy land of his own. "You have a woman waiting for you?" Belinda asked, then immediately regretted the boldness of the question. But Preston did not seem offended. "No," he said simply. "I have not had much time for courting, always moving from one cattle drive to the next, and to be honest, I have not met anyone who made me want to stop moving." He glanced up at her, and something in his expression made Belinda's heart beat a little faster. "What about you? Is there a man in your camp who is waiting for you to return?" "No," Belinda said quietly. "There was one a few years ago, a warrior named Running Elk. But he was killed in a raid by soldiers. Since then, I have focused on caring for my grandmother. She is all the family I have left." "I am sorry," Preston said, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. "That must have been hard." "It was, but life goes on. We endure because we must." They walked in silence for a while after that, but it was a comfortable silence, not awkward. Belinda found herself studying Preston as he led the horse, noticing the way the sunlight caught in his wheat-colored hair, the strength in his shoulders and back, the careful way he navigated the terrain to make the journey easier for her. He was a good man, she thought. Kind and decent in a world that often seemed to have little room for kindness or decency. By midday, they reached the canyon. Belinda recognized the distinctive red rocks immediately and felt a rush of relief. She slid down from the horse and stood beside Preston, looking up at the place where her people had made their camp. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could see figures moving among the shelters. "Thank you," she said, turning to face Preston. "You saved my life, and you have been nothing but kind to me. I will not forget this." Preston smiled that warm smile of his. "It was my pleasure, Belinda Stone. I am just glad I was there when you needed help." He hesitated, then added, "If you ever need anything, if your grandmother gets worse, or if there is any way I can help, my cabin is always open to you. You know where to find me." Belinda felt a strange tightness in her chest. She did not want to say goodbye, she realized. This man, this stranger she had known for less than a day, had shown her more kindness than she had experienced in years. "I hope I will see you again," she said softly. "I hope so too," Preston replied, and the way he looked at her made her breath catch in her throat. Then she forced herself to turn away and began climbing the rocky path that led up to the camp. When she reached the top and looked back, Preston was still standing there, watching her. He raised one hand in farewell, and she raised hers in return. Then he mounted his horse and rode away, back toward his lonely cabin on the prairie. Belinda's grandmother was overjoyed to see her, weeping with relief and scolding her at the same time for worrying her so terribly. The other members of the band gathered around, wanting to hear about the storm and how she had survived. Belinda told them about Preston and his cabin, about his kindness and his promise of help if they ever needed it. Some of the elders were skeptical. White men and their promises could not be trusted, they said. It was probably a trap, a way to find out where they were camped so he could bring soldiers down on them. But Belinda's grandmother, whose name was White Dove and who was respected for her wisdom, shook her head. "Not all white men are the same, just as not all Apache are the same," she said in their language. "If this man saved Belinda and asked nothing in return, then perhaps he is one of the good ones. They do exist, even if they are rare." Belinda thought about Preston often in the days that followed. She helped care for her grandmother, who slowly began to recover her strength, and she went about her usual tasks of gathering plants and preparing food. But her mind kept drifting back to the cabin on the prairie, to the man with the blue eyes and the kind smile. 2 weeks after the storm, Belinda found herself walking in the direction of Preston's cabin. She told herself she was just checking the snares she had set in that direction, but she knew the truth. She wanted to see him again. She needed to see him again, though she could not have explained why. She approached the cabin cautiously, suddenly nervous. What if he did not want to see her? What if he had only been kind out of obligation, and now that she was safe, he wanted nothing more to do with her? But before she could lose her nerve and turn back, the cabin door opened and Preston stepped out. His face broke into a huge grin when he saw her. "Belinda, I was hoping you would come back." The relief that flooded through her was almost overwhelming. "I wanted to thank you again. And to see how you were doing." "I am doing well, much better now that you are here. Come inside, I will make coffee." They sat in the cabin and talked for hours. Belinda told him about her grandmother's recovery, and Preston told her about a problem he was having with coyotes getting after his calves. It was easy and comfortable, like talking to an old friend rather than someone she had only met once before. When Belinda finally left to return to her camp before dark, Preston walked with her part of the way. "Will you come back?" he asked as they prepared to part. "Do you want me to?" "Very much." Belinda smiled. "Then I will come back," and she did. Again and again over the following weeks, Belinda found reasons to visit Preston's cabin. Sometimes she brought him gifts, wild plants that were good for cooking or small items she had made with her own hands. He, in turn, gave her things she could bring back to her people: flour and sugar, ammunition for their few rifles, wool blankets that would be welcome when winter came. They were falling in love, though neither of them spoke of it at first. It was there in the way Preston's face lit up whenever Belinda arrived, in the way she found herself thinking of him constantly when they were apart. It was there in the accidental touches that seemed to linger longer each time, in the way their eyes met and held across the cabin. One warm afternoon in late summer, they were sitting outside the cabin watching the sun set over the prairie when Preston reached over and took Belinda's hand in his. She looked at him in surprise, and he met her gaze steadily. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice serious. "I've come to care for you very deeply, Belinda. More than I have ever cared for anyone. I know this is complicated. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this cannot work, but I had to tell you how I feel." Belinda's heart was racing. She turned her hand over so their palms pressed together, their fingers intertwining. "I feel the same way," she said quietly. "I have tried not to. I have told myself all the reasons why loving you is foolish and dangerous, but I cannot help it. When I am with you, I feel happy in a way I have not felt since I was a child." Preston lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Then we will figure out the rest, together." But figuring out the rest proved more difficult than either of them had anticipated. Belinda's people were growing concerned about her frequent absences. Some of the younger warriors had begun to mutter that she was betraying her people by spending time with a white man, and Preston faced his own challenges. Other ranchers and settlers in the area had heard rumors that he was friendly with the Apache, and they did not approve. One man, a rancher named Hector Burke who owned a spread about 20 miles south, made a point of warning Preston that helping Indians was a good way to get himself killed or driven out of the territory. "I do not care what they think," Preston told Belinda when she expressed her worries. "You are more important to me than the good opinion of men like Burke." "But this is your home," Belinda said. "Your dream. I do not want you to lose it because of me." "You are my dream now," Preston said simply and kissed her. It was their first kiss, sweet and gentle and full of promise. Belinda felt like she was falling and flying at the same time, her entire world narrowing down to the feeling of Preston's lips on hers, his arms around her, his heart beating against her chest. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I love you," Preston said, his forehead resting against hers. "I love you, Belinda Stone." "I love you too," she whispered. "I love you, Preston Xavier." They knew they could not keep meeting in secret forever. Eventually, they would have to make a choice about their future. That choice came sooner than either of them expected. It was early autumn when soldiers came to the canyon where Belinda's people were camped. There had been a raid on a settlement 50 miles to the north, and even though Belinda's band had had nothing to do with it, the soldiers did not care. All Apache were guilty in their eyes. They gave the people 1 hour to pack what they could carry and prepare to be relocated to a reservation in New Mexico. White Dove was too frail to make such a journey. She knew it, and Belinda knew it. The old woman took her granddaughter's hand and spoke urgently. "You must go to your cowboy. He loves you and you love him. Stay with him. Build a life with him." "I cannot leave you," Belinda said, tears streaming down her face. "You can and you will. I am old, granddaughter. I have lived a full life. But you are young and you have a chance at happiness. Do not throw it away out of obligation to me. Come with me. Preston will welcome you, I know he will." White Dove shook her head. "I will go with our people. I will not abandon them, and the journey will be easier for them if they know I am content with this decision. But you, my bright girl, you must choose your own path. And I believe your path lies with Preston." Belinda knew her grandmother was right, but that did not make the choice any easier. She held the old woman close, memorizing the feeling of her embrace, the smell of sage and smoke that always clung to her. "I will never forget you," she whispered. "And I will never forget you. Go now before the soldiers see you leave. Go and be happy." Belinda slipped away from the camp as her people gathered their belongings. She ran across the prairie, tears blurring her vision, her heart breaking and soaring at the same time. She ran all the way to Preston's cabin and burst through the door, startling him from his work. "Belinda, what is wrong?" She told him everything in a rush of words, about the soldiers and the forced relocation and her grandmother's insistence that she stay behind. Preston listened, his face growing grim, and then he pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried. "You will stay here," he said when her tears finally subsided. "With me. We will be married properly, and anyone who has a problem with it can go to hell." "Are you sure?" Belinda asked, searching his face. "This will make your life harder. People will talk. They may even refuse to do business with you. I have never been more sure of anything in my life. You are my home now, Belinda, the only home I need." They were married 3 days later by a circuit preacher who rode through the territory once a month. The preacher was an old man with kind eyes who did not seem troubled by the fact that Belinda was Apache. He pronounced them husband and wife in the tiny cabin, with only Preston's bay horse as a witness, and wished them well. That night, lying in Preston's arms in the bed that was now their shared bed, Belinda felt a peace she had not known was possible. She had lost so much, her family and her people and the life she had known. But she had gained something precious too. She had gained love and hope, and a place where she truly belonged. The first year of their marriage was not easy. Many of the neighboring ranchers and settlers made it clear they disapproved of Preston's choice of wife. Some refused to work with him, and others spread ugly rumors. But Preston never wavered. He stood beside Belinda always, defending her, protecting her, loving her with a fierce devotion that made her fall more in love with him every day. Belinda worked hard to prove herself to the community. She had skills that were valuable on the frontier. She could track game with uncanny accuracy. She knew which plants were good for medicine and which were poisonous. She could predict weather changes by reading the sky and the behavior of animals. Slowly, some of the neighbors began to see her as an asset rather than a threat. When the wife of a nearby rancher fell ill with a fever, Belinda made a tea from plants she gathered that broke the fever and saved the woman's life. After that, attitudes began to shift. Not everyone accepted her, but enough people did that the hostility lessened. Preston's ranch grew slowly but steadily. With Belinda's help, he was able to expand his herd and improve his land. She had a gift for understanding animals, and the cattle seemed to respond to her gentle handling. Together, they built a life that was richer and fuller than either of them had dared to hope for. 18 months after their wedding, Belinda discovered she was pregnant. She told Preston one evening after supper, nervous about his reaction. But he whooped with joy, picked her up, and spun her around the cabin until she was dizzy and laughing. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1880. The birth was long and difficult, but Belinda was strong, and she had learned healing practices from her grandmother that helped her through the worst of it. Preston never left her side, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, whispering words of encouragement. When the baby finally came, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Preston wept openly. They named him Peter White Dove Xavier, honoring both Preston's father and Belinda's grandmother. Peter had his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair, and from the moment he was born, he owned both their hearts completely. Life with a baby was exhausting but joyful. Belinda had never imagined she could be this happy. She watched Preston with their son, saw the gentleness and patience he showed, and loved him even more than she thought possible. Peter was a healthy, curious child who grew quickly. By his first birthday, he was walking, and by his second, he was talking in full sentences, switching easily between English and the Apache words his mother taught him. When Peter was 3, Belinda gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Beatrice, though they called her Bee. She had Preston's wheat-colored hair and Belinda's brown eyes, and she was as fierce and determined as her mother had been at that age. Where Peter was thoughtful and careful, Bee was impulsive and fearless, climbing everything she could reach and constantly getting into mischief. The ranch continued to prosper. Preston hired a few hands to help with the cattle, young men who did not care that their boss had married an Apache woman and who were respectful to Belinda. The cabin, which had seemed perfectly adequate for one person, was now far too small for a family of 4. Preston spent the better part of a year building a proper house, a frame structure with 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a parlor where the family could gather in the evenings. By 1885, Preston and Belinda's ranch was one of the most successful in the area. They ran over 300 head of cattle, and Preston had purchased additional land to expand their grazing area. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. Belinda sometimes thought about her grandmother and wondered what had become of her. She had heard rumors over the years about the reservation where her people had been taken, none of them good. She prayed that White Dove had passed peacefully, surrounded by the people she had chosen to stay with. She hoped her grandmother knew somehow that Belinda had found the happiness she had wanted for her. One afternoon in late summer, a rider came to the ranch. He was an Apache man, middle-aged and travel-worn, and he asked to speak with Belinda. Preston was wary at first, protective of his wife and children, but Belinda assured him it was all right. The man's name was Gray Wolf, and he had known Belinda's grandmother. He had news, he said, but he wanted to deliver it gently. White Dove had died 2 years ago on the reservation. It had been peaceful, he assured Belinda. She had simply gone to sleep one night and not woken up. But before she died, she had spoken often of her granddaughter and the choice Belinda had made. She had been proud, Gray Wolf said. Proud that Belinda had chosen love and life over duty and death. Belinda wept when she heard this, but they were tears of relief as much as grief. Her grandmother had not suffered. She had died knowing Belinda was happy. That was a gift, and Belinda was grateful for it. Gray Wolf stayed for supper, and Preston insisted he spend the night before continuing his journey. At the table, with Peter and Bee chattering away and Preston teasing them gently, Gray Wolf smiled. "Your grandmother was wise," he told Belinda. "She knew you would find your place in this world. And it is clear you have." After Gray Wolf left the next morning, Belinda stood on the porch of her home and looked out at the land she and Preston had built a life on. Peter was playing in the yard with their dog, a shaggy mutt Preston had brought home as a puppy. Bee was helping her father mend a section of fence, more hindrance than help, but Preston did not seem to mind. The sun was warm on Belinda's face, and a breeze carried the scent of wildflowers across the prairie. She thought about the girl she had been, lost in a storm, frightened and alone. That girl had been found by a kind man who had given her shelter, and in giving her shelter, he had given her a future. She had found her forever home, not just in the physical place where she lived, but in the family she and Preston had created together. Life was not always easy. There were still people who looked at her with suspicion or disdain because of her heritage. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken fences, all the challenges that came with ranching on the frontier. But none of that mattered because she had Preston, and she had her children, and she had the knowledge that she was loved completely and unconditionally. Preston came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I am thinking about storms," Belinda said softly, "and how sometimes getting lost is the only way to be found." Preston turned her in his arms so she was facing him, His blue eyes were warm and full of love. "I thank God for that storm every day. It brought you to me." "And I thank the storm too," Belinda said. She reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "Because it brought me home." He kissed her then, and Peter made a disgusted noise from the yard which made Bea giggle. They broke apart, laughing, and went to join their children. The future stretched out before them, full of possibility and promise. There would be more children, 3 more over the next 10 years. Twin boys named Paul and Patrick, and finally another daughter, Bridget, who would be the baby of the family. The ranch would continue to grow and prosper. Peter would eventually take over the running of it, with his siblings helping in various ways. Bea would marry a schoolteacher who moved to the area and would become a teacher herself, educating not just her own children but dozens of others. The twins would both become skilled horsemen, known throughout the territory for their ability to break and train even the wildest mustangs. And Bridget, the youngest, would inherit her mother's gift with plants and healing, becoming a much sought-after midwife and healer. But all of that was still to come. On this late summer afternoon, Preston and Belinda were simply 2 people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together through determination and love. They stood together on the porch of their home, watching their children play, and knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be. As the years passed and their hair turned gray, as their children grew and had children of their own, Preston and Belinda never forgot the storm that had brought them together. They would tell the story to their grandchildren, who would listen with wide eyes and beg to hear it again and again. The tale of the Apache girl who was lost in a storm, and the cowboy who found her and gave her not just shelter but love, and how she found in him and in this wild, beautiful land her forever home. They grew old together, working side by side on the ranch they had built. Preston's hair turned white, and Belinda's face gained lines from years of smiling and squinting into the sun. But to each other, they were always as they had been that first night in the cabin, young and full of hope, finding in each other something precious and rare. Preston died first, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72. Belinda mourned him deeply, but she did not fall apart. She had his love in her memories, his children and grandchildren surrounding her, and the land they had worked together as a testament to what they had built. She lived another 7 years, active and sharp until the very end, helping to raise the younger grandchildren and passing on the stories and traditions of her people so they would not be forgotten. When Belinda finally passed away at the age of 77, surrounded by 3 generations of family, her last words were about Preston. "Tell him I am coming," she whispered to Peter, who held her hand as she slipped away. "Tell him to wait for me." They buried her next to Preston on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the prairie stretching out to the horizon. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered for the funeral, a testament to the love that had started with a storm and a chance meeting, and had grown into something that would echo through generations. The ranch remained in the family, passed down from parent to child, and on quiet nights when the wind blew across the prairie, some said you could still feel the presence of Preston and Belinda, watching over the land they loved and the family they had created. Their story became a legend in the area, told and retold until it was hard to separate fact from embellishment. But the core of it remained true. An Apache girl lost in a storm, a cowboy who offered shelter and kindness, and a love that transcended the boundaries of culture and prejudice to create something beautiful and lasting. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the hardships they faced or the obstacles they overcame, but the simple fact that they had loved each other with complete devotion, had built a life together that was rich and full, and had created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Belinda had found her forever home, not in a place but in a person, and that home had given her a happiness beyond anything she could have imagined on that terrifying night when the storm drove her to Preston's door. The cabin where they first met still stood, weathered and old but maintained by the family as a reminder of where it all began. And sometimes, on the anniversary of that fateful storm, family members would gather there to remember Preston and Belinda, to tell their story one more time, and to give thanks for the love that had created their family and shaped their lives. Years turned into decades and decades into a century, and still the story endured. The ranch changed with the times, adapting to new technologies and new ways of doing things, but it remained in the family, a tribute to the man and woman who had started it all. And though the world changed dramatically, from the wild frontier days of the 1870s and 1880s, the love story of Preston Xavier and Belinda Stone remained a constant, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected meetings can lead to the most extraordinary lives. Their descendants would often marvel at the courage it must have taken for Preston to open his door to a stranger in a storm, and for Belinda to trust him enough to enter. They would wonder at the love that had grown between two people from such different worlds, and they would be grateful that their ancestors had been brave enough to follow their hearts, despite all the reasons they should not have. And somewhere, in whatever place spirits go when they leave this world, Preston and Belinda were together still, watching over their family and their land, content in the knowledge that their love had created something that would last forever. The storm that had brought them together had long since passed, but its legacy endured in every child born to their line, in every acre of land that bore their name, and in every heart that heard their story and believed, even for a moment, in the power of love to overcome any obstacle. That was the true forever home Belinda had found, not just a place or a person, but a love so strong that it transcended time itself, becoming a part of the land and the family and the very air that blew across the Colorado prairie. And in finding that home, she had given countless others a home as well, a place of belonging and love that would endure for generations to come. The girl lost in the storm had become a woman who had created a sanctuary, a haven, a legacy. She had found her forever home, and in doing so, she had helped countless others find theirs as well.